Professor Matthew Kiernan. How you on, mate?
Well, Mark, how are you?
Good, mate. Well, you tell me.
We'll get to that.
I'm your patient. Welcome to Project 100, mate. Thanks for doing this. It's really important. So, maybe just tell us a little bit about your medical qualifications. So what's the deal? I know you're a neuroscientist. I know you're a neurologist, but just tell me a little bit about what that all means, because a lot of people don't even know what that means.
So I did medicine at university, and then after medicine, you do general training, intern, resident, registrar, and you choose a stream, whether it's surgery, physician training, obstetrics and gynecology, psychiatry. I chose medical training, so physician training, and that's general training. You cover all of the subspecialties, cardiology, hematology. Then you choose your own subspecialty, which for me was neurology. So you do 3 years of neurology, and usually that means later incorporating research. So I did a PhD at the University of New South Wales. And luckily for me, Australia has a training position in London at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, which is at University College London. So that's awarded in Australia. And I was fortunate to get that role, went over to London and then stayed there for 5 years before coming back to Sydney. And most recently, I was what's called the Bushell Chair of Neurology at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. So it was for a decade. That was the first professorship in neurology around Australia. And then more recently, there was a position became vacant, the Chief Executive Officer at Neuroscience Research Australia. And I took up that role. That's where I am now at the Randwick Precinct, also at the University of New South Wales, and a neurologist at Prince of Wales Hospital, South Eastern Sydney Local Health District.
And are you still a clinician?
Yeah. So I'm working as a neurologist about half my week, seeing patients and also trying to involve patients in clinical trials nationally and internationally. The other half of my week is looking after the Research Institute, and that has about 550 neuroscientists divided into 30 groups, covering, I think, the three themes that we're working on are neurodegeneration and dementia. And that incorporates a brain bank, which is a national and international facility. We have mental health, so particularly the neuroscience of mental health, the underlying mechanisms. And the third theme is translational neuroscience. So using all of the strengths of the university, engineering and, psychology to look at, problems such as spinal cord injury, pain, trying to bring in technology as an alignment with neuroscience research.
So you might just explain what neuroscience is, because neurology is different to neuroscience, and you are a neuroscientist. I presume your PhD is in neuroscience. Yeah. And is it sort of, relatively speaking, a new stream, relatively speaking, in that more people are doing it these days than ever before. What is neuroscience?
Very good question. So I think it's really the science of anything to do with nerves and brain, so brain tissue. But for neurology, that's a clinical discipline. And you can be both, but a neuroscientist might just focus on purely the science. It might be molecular, it might be genetics, might be looking at a cell type.
Could be electrical.
Could be electrical, totally electrical. And it could be artificial intelligence. It could be purely on structural imaging like MRI. So that's just a focus of science. Neurology makes it a clinical discipline and, working with patients.
How do those two fit in together, though? Maybe in the context of Neuro, where you're the CEO, which is a joint venture, as I understand, between UNSW, University of New South Wales, and the Prince of Wales Hospital. And it's, by the way, it's a big deal for anybody who hasn't seen it. Like, there's a massive building out there. It looks like pretty new to me. It looks like a big investment by somebody. I don't know whether state government, federal government, university, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's a big deal. How do those two interact? Neurology and neuroscience. Is one more about doing research? Is science about more understanding the science of the brain? Because the reason I actually matter is because there's a lot of doctors around, okay? And they are very good at diagnosing and perhaps giving you something to take for whatever it is they diagnosed. But I find, I'm not knocking them, it's just an observation. They're so damn busy, they don't always have the opportunity to keep up with the science. And yet neuroscience seems to be not so much involved in the clinic, but is about within its various silos. But it's about keeping up with the science and or maybe making the science. Am I right?
Yeah. So neuroscience would be very much discovery. and neurology would be translation. In other words, how does that get into the clinic looking after patients? So you're right, they should be aligned. And that's where the movement is nationally and internationally. So governments want neuroscientists working on problems that society wants to deal with, whether it's psychosis, whether it's dementia. So you have to use the strengths of a science background to look at mechanisms, to look at new treatments, discovery. And then once that discovery is made, can it translate through and ultimately be prescribed, as you mentioned, from your doctor to the patient? And that's the final outcome, and that is such a amazing outcome for society, but for individual patients.
We see a lot of you would see it all the time, but there's a lot of stuff going on overseas. It looks like the place to be is in the United States or some other place around the world. How does Australia rank? I mean, you read all the journals, you would see all the research, particularly in your current role. How do we rank as a country relative to the rest of the world when it comes to science around the brain?
Well, we really are way ahead in Australia.
Wow.
And we punch well above our weight. And probably, discovery-wise, 10 to 15, 20% is linked to Australia in some form. Probably one of the issues that we've had as a country is once the discovery is made, we often sell it off. And whether we sell it off particularly to North America or Western Europe, that's usually the outcome. So what we need to do now is try and harness those discoveries and keep them in Australia and try and develop them through for the benefit of not just Australia, but worldwide. And that would then bring the income back into Australia. So we tend to sell off too early, and we need visionaries like you and investors to try and keep those discoveries in Australia and bring them through. Part of the problem is that, international pharma companies are particularly North American based. So like Boston is the Mecca, Western Europe, Germany, UK, France, that's where they all are. There's really only one major international pharma company in Australia, that's CSL. And even then they have to have their major outlet through America, North America, King of Prussia. So it's CSL Behring. And I think that's probably related to our population. But if we had a few more international players here, Australia would really take off.
Okay, so we first met through the Brain and Mind Centre where you were when my mother was first diagnosed with MND through a neurologist just down the road at St Vincent's. They said the best place to go was Brain and Mind Centre, which is where you were at the time, and motor neurone disease, which, by the way, I have to tell you, I had no sense of whatsoever of neurodegenerative diseases. And what was interesting is, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I used to ring my mum. By the way, my mother's of Irish background, and I do want to touch on this in a moment, and I'd say your surname is the same. But I used to ring my mother on my way home probably every night, if not every night, definitely every second night, and just talk to her during that period because I knew that between my office and my home was about 25 minutes, and my mother being Irish could talk. And I knew that I could say, Mum, I'm home. I've got to go inside for my dinner. And that would be the end of my, so I'd have a nice fixed period. And I did it for many, many years, like all my working career whilst I've had a mobile phone. And I remember one night I was talking to my mother, and my mother didn't drink. And I talked to my mother, and she sounded like she'd been drinking. And my dad didn't mind a scotch every now and then. I said to Mum, hey, Mum, you had a drink with Dad? And she said, no, dear, no, I haven't had a drink. And I said, you sure? I said, because it sounded like you're slurring your words. Anyway. A long story becoming a short story. I got nervous. I didn't know what to do. I never met a neurologist in my life. I bumped into my friend Phil Stricker here, who's a urologist, and he quickly got me referred to somebody at St Vincent's, like literally 2 days later. They did a series of tests, which we may quickly touch on, but they weren't blood tests or anything like that. They were sort of sensory tests. Then she was sent to you guys. Within 6 months, she passed away. One of the things I found out, or I was told, is that people with Irish genetics or Celtic genetics is probably a better way of putting it, have a statistically more likely to get this as a genetic disease than other people. Is that the truth, or am I just imagining that?
It's the truth. So I remember your mother well, and she's a lovely lady. And as you say, she had some slurring of speech, and it turned out that she had motor neurone disease.
ALS, as it was called.
Yeah, ALS. And we call it bulbar onset. So bulbar means the tongue and mouth region.
Yeah.
And one of the more common genes or genetic processes is called C9 open reading frame 72, C9ORF. And that can be traced back to one individual in Finland 1,000 years ago.
Wow.
And then we've seen the movement of this one person and the extended family through Western Europe, and then migration from Western Europe to Australia and North America. So every time we find this gene, we find the original Finnish haplotype, the founder. So it's all related to one person 1,000 years ago. Interestingly, there's none of this gene representation in Asia, for instance. So the Vikings never made it to Asia. But it's interesting. So you're right, a very high proportion of Western Europeans, and particularly Ireland and Great Britain, United Kingdom.
And I was also told at the time, and then I think this is important for people in terms of their habits and behaviors. I was also told at the time that you might have the mutation or the mutated gene, which goes back 1,000 years. But my mother never got it until she's 86 years of age. And I was also told that it needs another element to sort of excite that gene into turning into ALS. And at the time, this is like 7, 8 years ago now, but they said either exposure to chemicals, heavy chemicals, alcoholism, which is a problem in Ireland, as we know, and severe respiratory infections. Is that so? Should we? Maybe not everyone's going to run and get a genetic test, but is that sort of quite straight up informing us that we've got to be careful about our behaviours and what we get exposed to? And is there any expansion on that? Am I correct in what I just said?
Absolutely correct. I suppose the interesting thing is we're born with these genetic changes. So that's our makeup. Why is it then that some people manifest disease and some people don't? So let's say, an individual has this gene. There's no guarantee that they're going to get the disease.
Yeah.
So they could die from something totally unrelated at the age of 95, and that gene will never have any play in their life. Presumably, there are compensations going on in the brain and the nervous tissue. So those compensations can keep things under control. And then ultimately, a stress triggers the process of the original cell death. And then there's a sort of a cascade that spreads through the brain or the spinal cord. And we know that if we've looked at cancer modeling, and we've taken that now into neurology. And if we look at the onset of a disease and the incidence, it's a straight line. And the slope of that straight line is 6. So 6 things have to happen for you to manifest the disease. If you have a gene, that's 3 of the steps. So there's another 3 steps. And as you mentioned, it's a severe stress. So we know it, very extreme cases, someone who gets hit by lightning, or they get a severe electrical injury. We've got an entry and exit wound. Motor neurone disease begins in that region.
Wow.
So that's the stress. And you mentioned then, severe respiratory infection or, severe alcohol. Any of those things could be sufficient to trigger the process. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how that happens. That's the problem.
But it could inform us about, because it's actually healthy not to be an alcoholic. It's actually healthy not to be exposed to poisons of any type. It's actually healthy to stay healthy enough not to get a severe respiratory disease. And I recall that my mother actually had a severe flu, the worst chest infection she'd ever had. She lost 10 kilos during that period prior to getting the diagnosis. And I often wonder whether that was the very thing that actually catalyzed the whole process. But I guess, because this project that I'm undertaking, and you're well aware of because I've actually consulted you in relation to myself, it's about not really avoiding things that you're never going to be able to avoid. There are some things we're just going to be unavoidable. Eventually something's going to kill us. It's going to be heart, neurodegenerative disease, cancer or something like that, because you're not going to, you just don't die. You die of something. Something fails. The question here is about how do I extend my period of not sort of bringing it on myself, and that sort of then talks to me to be about behavior. what I get exposed to, or more importantly, what I expose myself to, or knowingly, as opposed to being unwittingly exposed to something. The more I become aware of things, which is what this whole program is about, which is why I got you here today. If I become aware of things, then I might become much more likely than not to avoid something that might actually cause me a problem. And the simple things: don't drink too much, Mark. Don't go around getting exposed to some Monsanto poison. It's simple. Try to live a healthy life so you don't get severe COVID, or you might be 70. Maybe you should get vaccinated. I know all the anti-vaxxers are now going to send me a text, but it doesn't matter. But maybe it's something you decide to do because it's your call, and people must take more control of their outcomes. You're a doctor, and various other things, but you're a doctor at first hand. How important do you think it is and that's what this program is all about, but how important is it for patients actually to start to take a bit more control of their outcomes? And when they come to you, say, hey, Matthew, which is what I do because I've got my trusty file here, which I take everywhere with me. Sooner or later, I'm going to turn this into some sort of dashboard with all my stuff in there. I haven't done that yet. I'm going to get someone to build me a bit of software to put it all in a dashboard. But how important do you think it is for someone to come and say, look, Matthew, I've had these tests done. What do you reckon?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. And that's where the focus of medicine is now. Can you prevent conditions, or can you manage conditions as well as possible? And to do that, you have to have an understanding, but also then you have to be willing to take that message on board and control it. And I think a lot of these things are in individual control. So that, I think the message that you're bringing across is critically important. We have to understand processes, and if we can manage lifestyle factors, we can actually control a lot of these conditions, including neurodegeneration and dementia.
So okay, let's talk about neurodegeneration, because so here we are, we've got a highly qualified, well-positioned, access to the best research in the country, experience with all sorts of patients. What are the neurodegenerative diseases that we need to even be aware of? Because we all heard of someone's got Parkinson's and maybe MND, but what are we talking about here? Is there 4 big ones or 5 big ones?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest one is dementia. And dementia forms different parts. The most common one is Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
You've mentioned Parkinson's disease, also motor neuron disease, frontotemporal dementia. They'd be probably the key neurodegenerative dementia conditions that we're considering.
Are they sort of covering like 90% of the population to get neurodegenerative diseases?
Easily, 90%.
90%. So, Okay, let's talk about those 4. Like, maybe let's start off with Parkinson's as just for a place to start. What are we talking about there? What is that?
So Parkinson's was originally thought to be a clinical diagnosis. So particularly everyone would understand there's a tremor usually associated with Parkinson's.
Your hands are shaking.
Yep. Then there's also what we call akinesia. Kinesia is movement. A is no movement. So reduced movement. And that includes facial expression, reduced blink rate, reduced facial reactivity, smiling, and also reduced movement in general, so walking. And the third thing is rigidity, so stiffness. And so when you test someone's limbs, they're stiff, and it's particularly what we call cogwheeling. So that was a clinical diagnosis. If you had those 3 features, it was Parkinson's disease. But now with time, and this is really through the strengths of the community donating brains for research and through brain banks, we know that Parkinson's disease is particularly related to a protein change, alpha-synuclein. And that particular protein is involved in the coordination of movement, and linked to that is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. So now we understand the mechanisms of Parkinson's disease. There's a reduction in dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter, the signal, and we also know that if alpha-synuclein starts appearing and spreading, then you get a dementia associated with Parkinson's. It could be Lewy body dementia or Parkinson's dementia. So we've understood now the mechanism. So that's Parkinson's.
Can I just ask you about that? So what produces the protein that reduces the dopamine?
Well,
something in the brain?
That's a Nobel Prize waiting to happen.
Wow, okay.
There are some unusual instances.
I thought we're going to sort of share one Nobel Prize right now.
I would love to know that one. But there are some unusual instances. So, for instance, there was a group of intravenous drug users in New York, and they started injecting a compound which they thought was speed or heroin, and there was another compound in there, and that caused a depletion of all the dopamine cells, and they obviously developed a Parkinsonian syndrome. We also know from the work from Oliver Sacks, Awakenings, in the movie with Robin Williams, that encephalitis lethargica, so the Spanish flu in 1918, again, depleted dopamine, and so patients were basically locked in. They were asleep, and then they were given dopamine. They reactivated for a period of time. So there are things that can deplete dopamine, but the actual form that it happens in Parkinson's, we don't know necessarily how it happens. I suppose it's one of the key diseases that's linked to the gut-brain axis. And so people are thinking that maybe it's something that is ingested, that is taken through either the lymph nodes or cells of the stomach, transferred up the vagus nerve and into the brain. And these are current theories of Parkinson's, but to be honest, the mechanisms aren't established.
Well, given what you just said, and that's very interesting, the gut-brain axis. I mean, by the way, maybe you could explain that, because most people think the gut is something separate to the brain, but they have a connection. So what are we talking about here, gut-brain axis?
So anything that happens in the gut, in the stomach, can influence the general environment. But we also know another classic disease that helped us understand this was mad cow disease, or variant CJD. And the way that was diagnosed is through a tonsillar biopsy. So when people ate the bad beef, it was absorbed through the stomach into the lymph nodes, which are the tonsils, and then it got up into the brain and spread through the brain, and patients died.
Wow.
And they worked out then that it was a prion protein, a protein that couldn't be broken down, that came from the beef, the food practices in the United Kingdom. But then it turned out you had to have a genetic mutation. So some people could eat as much bad beef as they wanted to, and they'll never get CJD or mad cow disease. But if you had a genetic variant that you were born with, that predisposed you to developing mad cow disease. So it's a combination of genes and environment, back to what you were suggesting.
Sort of like behavior and environment. That's interesting. So in order for us to produce dopamine, if we just go back to Parkinson's for a moment, maybe you could explain how that happens, how receptors in various parts of the brain actually receive things and push out the dopamine, and are the receptors being blocked for some reason and not doing their job? Is that why we're not getting the dopamine? Is there something stopping the receptors from doing their job?
It's a reduction in manufacture. So the brain isn't producing dopamine, and the dopamine cells have died. They've degenerated.
Right.
So it's a neurodegenerative condition.
Right.
No dopamine being secreted or released. Interestingly, then, there was an idea that maybe if we put in a whole lot of stem cells with, brain cells that had dopamine, we could actually treat this. So that was a form of treatment. Unfortunately, what would happen is the cells were put in, but they weren't controlled in any mechanism. So then what would happen is the cells actually produced too many. They went out of control. They produced too much dopamine. So people had too much excessive movement, and that caused degeneration in itself. So sometimes you have a scientific theory and then you follow it through with a clinical trial, and the outcome is whatever the outcome is. Unfortunately, so far, we haven't been able to get over the reduction in dopamine producing cells in Parkinson's. We can treat the symptoms. So if you take tablets, which are dopamine, so that's Sinemet Matapar, that's dopamine which you swallow, it goes into the stomach, goes up into the brain, and it puts dopamine back in. But that's symptomatic therapy. It doesn't alter the cause of the disease. So your Parkinson's will have the same outcome whether we treat you with dopamine or not. However, it's far more pleasant, and you behave normally, and your movement is normal if you take the tablets to a degree. The other way that we've been looking at as well is deep brain stimulation, and you'll see that Michael J. Fox had that done.
Yes.
So by putting electrodes into cells, we can artificially alter the environment such that the motor system is working, the coordination is working a lot better.
Because my friend John Cornell, who he had it done.
Yes.
Corny told me he went and had it, and actually worked for a couple of years. He ended up passing away, as you probably know. But but he had Parkinson's for a long, long time, like a long time, as I can recall, and maybe 15 years or something. I seem to recall, but it was actually dreadful. What are the sort of things that, like, do we look to our parents or our cousins? I mean, is there something very early stage we should think about or be aware of relative to maybe going off to our GP then and say, look, I've got a bit of a thing going on here. What are the very, very early signs, perhaps?
Yep. Well, I think the first thing is we've got to choose our parents. Unfortunately, we can't do that.
No.
But I think then we have to look after general health. And what I would do, I think everyone should see their general practitioner. And obviously you need to see them more commonly as you get older. But probably in the ages of, 30 to 40, it's worthwhile just getting a health check. And what would that consist of? Blood pressure and cholesterol in particular. Just a routine blood screen.
So cholesterol has some relationship to Parkinson's?
It has to all neurodegenerative diseases. So regardless of the diagnosis, if you can treat vascular risk factors, people do better. So at an individual and at a population level, looking after vascular risk factors, and that means blood pressure, cholesterol, looking after your body mass index, keeping your sugar levels down, not smoking. They're the key things that you can control, which will help outcomes regardless. I mean, obviously we're hoping that no one gets anything, and it gets well into their hundreds and then dies of something in their sleep. But in general, you can manage these neurodegenerative conditions through vascular risk factors very successfully.
Well, you once told me what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And I'd never really connected the two because I've always thought of them as sort of individual silos. So let's just talk about what's good for the heart. I know you're not a cardiologist, and by the way, I know you're not here giving advice on this matter, and this is just a discussion between two mates. But people can listen to this and then go and see their GP or whoever it is that they seek advice from and get their own advice. But when you say vascular health, which is obviously starts with the heart, but vascular health relates to how blood gets pumped in and out of your brain. Is that because the brain needs blood and needs to also get rid of whatever blood it has used? Is that what we're talking about? Like, in other words, it needs to go up in the artery, come back in the veins.
Exactly.
And therefore we need good veins.
Exactly. So the heart is pumping, usually against gravity, because we're standing up or sitting up like we're doing now. As you say, that's through the carotid artery into the brain. The brain then has a whole vascular system of its own, which incorporates capillaries. And so all of the messages, the signaling that's going on through the brain needs the blood flow to basically, it's the energy factory of the brain. And so the more that you can look after that, the better things go. And so similar to a heart management, we do the same thing. We're into vascular health, critically important.
Right. So therefore, one of the tests we should be getting is, apart from getting just a general blood test, but we should be asking our GP to make sure that they look at our lipids in our blood. In other words, LDL, HDL, cholesterol. And if you saw somebody with really high LDL levels and let's call it even low HDL levels, they might be, I don't know what the word is, hypercholesteremia, whatever the word is, some long word like that. Is that a bit of a marker for maybe potential problems with the brain later on in their life?
It is a potential marker. And it's also then you understand that cholesterol reading in the setting of everything else that's going on. So you wouldn't want to just look at HDL and LDL, but that is an important marker. And then you combine it with other blood markers, but also vascular health in general. And I suppose as well as, as you get older, there are probably more things that you can do to look at this. So once you're into your 50s, 60s, etc., probably a coronary CT angiogram is something that most doctors would advise, and a calcium score.
Yeah.
So that's a way of looking at vascular disease, and we would say in a non-invasive way. So it's not a lot of pain or issues for an individual to have this test done. They're done in radiology practices all across Australia.
Yeah.
But that gives you a marker of whether vascular disease is an important issue, but it also is a marker to treat against. So you can use those scores and outcomes to help predict your own health, but also manage yourself.
I always say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I guess one of the good things about, what do those say? Let's call it the calcium score. And it's not a big deal. I've had it done. And, they inject you with something and they sort of put you in a CT machine and they watch the dye go through your bloodstream, and they just see if there's any blockages, etc., and they look at whether there's any calcification in your arteries around your heart, etc., and they give you a score. But what's important about these things, though, is if you get it done again, say a couple of years down the track, is seeing if there's change. How important is delta when it comes to managing your health?
Critically important. So the first thing is just the cross-sectional idea. So once you do get that calcium score, you can interpret that in the setting of all of your other vascular risk factors. But then if you can do another test in 5 to 10 years' time, that informs that first test. And you mentioned the high LDL and a low HDL. So if I had that and then I had a calcium score of 0, there'd be no need to intervene. It would be a matter of watching that.
Yes.
But if I had a low HDL, a very high LDL, and had a calcium score of 25, that's going to be an issue. So can we treat the cholesterol? Like that informs when you treat and how you treat.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So the whole cholesterol thing too, by the way, is a little bit more complicated than you and I are talking about. Obviously, much more complicated. And I will take you up on, you offered for me to talk to the best lipids guy, cholesterol guy in the country, in your view. And I will take that individual up on that at some stage, because I've been reading a lot about it. It's quite dense. It's quite fascinating too at the same time. But before I get on to dementia, because I have a particular question I want to talk to you about dementia and Alzheimer's, but as being one of the neurodegenerative diseases outside of Parkinson's, and I think we'll leave MND out. We've probably spoke enough about MND, even though I know it's one of your specialties. But we keep hearing other commentators who are, quite famous around the world talk about a line of, I think they're proteins that sit on LDL and HDL. They sit on top of the cholesterol. What are we talking about here, these apolipoproteins? I mean, we got the cholesterol molecule and there's something sits on top of it. Is that what is this protein?
Well, it's a protein that's linked to cholesterol, but there's also triglycerides. So these are all the fat constituents in our body.
Right.
And that's again, another mix. So we can interpret all of these together too. But there are conditions, and there are neurological conditions that are associated with different apolipoproteins too. And I suppose what we also then understand is the body is a metabolic factory, and we're working through a huge metabolism all day, every day, whether it's the food we're eating. All of these structures come into it, but also cholesterol is part of the lining of brain cells, so it's a critical part of brain function. So you need it, but there's levels that you have to be in between.
Well, this is probably bringing us to dementia, I think. Maybe can we just start off you defining what is Alzheimer's - dementia? I mean, are they different things, or are they one leads to the other? What are they?
So everyone puts the field of anything to do with memory, or in neurology use the word cognition, into this term dementia. Dementia is just an overarching term that incorporates everything. Now, it turns out that there are different forms of dementia. Probably the most common from a sort of a protein-based is Alzheimer's disease, which is related to amyloid and tau protein, which are abnormal in the brain. In the general population, vascular dementia would be the most common form. So the blood vessels in the brain have become harder. People are having like small strokes, micro strokes throughout the brain, such that parts of the brain aren't working, and that spreads. Okay, so vascular dementia is a second type. We've already touched on Parkinson's dementia, alpha-synuclein. We've mentioned frontotemporal dementia, which is another protein, TDP43. So dementia is the overarching term, but there are specific families within that definition.
So the most common one, as I understand, is vascular dementia, which is one of the things you got me to do is to get an ultrasound of my carotid arteries, which are both sides of my neck, just to see if they were clogged, and luckily they weren't. But the objective, I presume, is what you're trying to work out is, am I getting enough blood flow from my heart to my brain? But let's say I wasn't. So what could be an outcome? Does your brain die because it doesn't get enough blood? Is that brain cells die off? Is that what we're talking about?
Yep. And the carotid scan is a marker of blood vessels more generally, but that's a vessel that we can see. It's very hard to look at the small vessels in the head, although with some directed ultrasound you can. So with the carotid artery, the manifestation of a problem might be what's called a transient ischemic attack. So someone might be sitting at the dinner table and they can't speak. And you ask them a question, they just can't speak. And then a few minutes later, speeches come back and say, what was that due to? And then we might do an ultrasound of the carotid and show that there's a blockage there. So instead of 100% normal volume, it might be down to 30%, so 70% occlusion. So if someone had a 70% or higher occlusion and had presented with a transient ischemic attack, that's an indicator that blockage should be taken out, most likely through an operation, so neurosurgery. In some cases, it could be stenting, so putting a stent up into the carotid artery.
To open it up.
And opening it up. If it's less than 70%, generally we wouldn't do anything. It's medical management. So again, back to looking after cholesterol, sugars, body mass index, blood pressure. Yeah, and following it.
And perhaps some medication like statins.
Statins and a blood thinner.
Right. And just so we can get clear on, let's call it the ultrasound, it is, I remember when you gave me the referral, it was referred to as a Doppler. So anybody who does have to get this, they could see a Doppler is the same as an ultrasound. Basically, you're using the Doppler effect, which we all learn at school in science.
Absolutely.
Science book.
Physics. Yeah.
We all did that. And it's basically sending a sound in there. And because it's water in there, it sort of refracts the sound back, and you can actually measure the distance and the thickness and the wall, all that sort of stuff. So that's
you're a physicist. That's exactly.
Well, I just remember from school at science, but that's sort of what the Doppler dash ultrasound means. Yeah. But what you were trying to do when you got me to get this done, and I'm going to talk about the pre-Neuro test I had done before, but I will talk why I went to see you, but you were getting me to do that to make sure that I was getting, because I have an uncle, and so we did a familial analysis, and my uncle, my dad's youngest brother, actually has had a series of mini strokes and a larger stroke. Admittedly, he was a heavy smoker and drinker. Not now, but then. I've never done either. So, but you wanted to see whether or not this vascular dementia, which he now has, was something that could potentially be of something I need to be concerned about or start to manage better, given my age. Turned out no problem, but you ordered this thing because you wanted to see, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, are my neurons in my brain getting enough blood and enough oxygen and enough nutrients not to die off? Is that what happens if they die off? What happens if they don't get enough?
They do die off.
They die off.
Yep. So it is a plumbing approach similar to the heart. So it's a plumbing approach, and then presuming that all of the blood flow is normal, the energy is appropriate, then it's looking at the molecular level, which might be then, scans and also neurotransmitters.
So what started this off was me talking to you about, vascular dementia generally. It's a big topic now. Everybody's talking about it. They're talking about concussion. That's even a bigger topic. Is the fact that I had boxed for many, many years and I've had many, many concussions. So I got nervous about it, so I thought I'd better talk to you. But could you just touch on how do you see the connection between concussions and let's call it what everyone refers to as dementia? I don't want to touch on CTE because it's just out there, okay? Let's leave CTE alone. That's more for the pathologists who look at a brain once someone's passed away, I think, as I understand it. But let's just talk quickly about how concussions might somehow add to my opportunity to suffer from Alzheimer's and or dementia or anything else for that matter.
Yeah, well, so I think it's been well known in boxing probably over the last 100 years that if you get too many hits to the brain, there's a risk that you start to lose your memory.
Ali, Parkinson.
And Muhammad Ali is the classic example. And so pugilistica, so it's encephalitis pugilistica. So
that's a thing, is it?
Yes. And it's usually related to the volume of hits.
Yes.
So it builds up. And that's what they used to say about Muhammad Ali, that he did so much spar work and training. He used to let himself get hit a lot. And that was his strength. He could withstand it. But then you see the other side of this is a potential neurodegenerative condition. And it's usually, as I said, it's the number of hits. That's the general understanding
so
from the
mini
boxing.
concussions or something.
Yeah.
Like not necessarily being knocked out once. So if someone somehow has been in a car accident or fallen and hit the head, that might be a problem. But what you're talking about here in terms of sport, at least, is lots and lots and lots of this. Like it could be a football player just getting hit every week, week after week after week. It doesn't necessarily follow that someone who has had that. Sorry, start again. Why does then some people get dementia, as looks like as it is as a result of it, and some people had the same amount of hits, but they don't get dementia? Is there any science?
Well, you're asking
around this?
all of these, Nobel Prize-winning questions. Unfortunately, we don't know.
Yeah, we don't
so
know.
there must be a predisposition, because you're right. Some people have played, rugby, done boxing all their lives, and been hit so many times, and they're bang, completely, normal. So there must be protective factors, and there's your constitution. So it's again back to who your parents were and choosing your parents well. But we don't understand why some people get it and others don't.
Yeah, so let's talk about parents. Let's talk about, so when I had a blood test, I asked for not only apolipoprotein, or let's call it lipo A and lipo B, cholesterol, blah, 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 and a whole lot of other stuff, but I asked to see whether or not I had ApoE. And it came out that I have this ApoE 3 and 4 gene. They didn't say I had ApoE proteins. They're different, as I understand it. But what is ApoE 3, 4, 2? What are we talking about here?
So these, the understanding of this field comes from epidemiology. So looking at huge populations and looking at blood tests from, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And they've realized now that ApoE4 is linked to dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, so a higher incidence. Also, if you have ApoE4, it tends to lead to a more rapid progression. So it's a marker that can be used to inform.
So Chris Hemsworth in that show actually bravely got up and told the world that he has that gene. I'm here to say I also have it. But I don't know, maybe you can explain this part to me because I don't know. There's two terms which confuse me a little bit. One's heterozygous and the other one's homozygous. ApoE4. Does that mean like one parent or two parents? What are we talking about here?
That's it, one or two. So you get a gene from both. You get one from your mother, one from your father.
Yeah.
And homozygous is you've got both the same. Heterozygous is you've got one of each. And that depends. So if we're looking at an abnormality, you probably don't want to have the homozygous form because you've got the both risk factors.
Yes.
But obviously this interpretation, the discussion is different for every single type of condition that may be linked to genes. So I don't want to lead anyone astray. No. But that's just the general understanding of homozygous and heterozygous.
And from what I read, that 40% of patients, and this is epidemiologically, whatever the word is, but it's based on a broad population of people who had Alzheimer's disease, and according to that, 40% of those people who had Alzheimer's had the Z4. But it went on to say, just because you got it, there's obviously 60% of the people didn't have E4. So it's not causal, it's just correlation.
Yes.
It correlates statistically.
Exactly. And that's the interpretation. It's an association.
Yeah.
It's not cause and effect.
Yeah. So, but do you think people, I mean, I'm a bit weird about it, but do you think people should seek that answer to that question? Do you think it's something one should ask the GP to get tested? Does it inform you as a neurologist in any way relative to your patient? Does it help you with anything?
It does. So I think all knowledge is power, and I'm a scientist, so I want to know the knowledge. And I can understand if someone doesn't want to know the knowledge. So this is an individual decision. But I think then putting on the other hat as a clinician, as a doctor, you want to know risk factors. So you want to know these associations because then you can manage your patient. So again, when we talked about the carotid and looking at volumes, etc., we want to see what risk factors are present because these risks are cumulative. So if I had an abnormal cholesterol and apolipoprotein E4, and I had a father who died at the age of 52 from a heart attack, that person needs aggressive treatment. That's the message.
Right.
Whereas if I had apolipoprotein E4 and I have no other risk factors and my parents lived to, 100 and we don't even know what happened to them, then it's less of I know that person, I can be more conservative, and that helps to inform how to manage a condition. So there's lots of ways to manage patients or individuals, and preventative health, then we're looking at healthy individuals, and you have to work out how aggressive you need to be. And the risk factors inform that treatment algorithm.
So when I saw you, I had gone off, and prior to that, about 3 or 4 months before that, I got a bit carried away, and I went and got a test called a pre-nouveau test, which is basically an MRI of my whole body. You can't get it here in Australia. Maybe you can now, but you couldn't at the time. It was quite expensive. I did as part of an experiment relative to this program. I probably would not ordinarily have had it done. And it's an hour and a quarter, hour and 20 minutes in an MRI machine, which is not pleasant. But I got it done, and they looked at every organ and part of my body looking for mass. And they give a report, and they said, look at, there's something on your liver. So I had that checked. And they said there's something in your kidney. I had that checked. And then when I showed you on my brain, there was a small vein or something like that I showed to you. And then they said that's worth noting, but they didn't think there was anything of it. But you saw something on there which they never said anything about, and you noticed plaque in my brain. Now, no one said anything. They didn't say anything about the plaque, but because I showed you the image or the copy of the image. What does that mean, plaque in someone's brain? Because do our brains get plaque like our heart does? Arteries, I should say.
Yeah, it's the same thing. So plaque is usually a buildup of material either in the wall or beside the wall of a blood vessel, and happens in all organs of the body. And that's a marker of potentially reduced blood flow. So back to the plumbing concept of the brain. So that's an important piece of information to have. It's probably inevitable as we get older, we start accumulating plaque and we start accumulating blockages.
Right. That's interesting because then you said to me, then you went through my family history, etc., and then you ordered the carotid thing. But something that was really interesting to me is I happened to mention that I had what's this thing here called?
Dupuytren's contracture.
Yeah. Is it got another name? Do they give it some other sort of name? So they sort of call it the Viking gene sometimes.
Yeah, well, Dupuytren was I think to do with Vikings,
right.
etc.
It's people in Northern Europe.
Yes.
And then I have it in both hands.
Yeah.
And then I was reading about, you mentioned earlier, about amyloid not getting cleared out of your brain. Everyone's brain's got amyloid. And by the way, we've got amyloid in all throughout our body.
Yeah.
And I think there's a condition called amyloidosis or
there
something
is.
like that. And amyloidosis, as I understand it, can sit on tendons. And that there is potentially an example of amyloidosis on those tendons, which thickens the tendons. The amyloid is sort of sitting on there. They're not being removed. And I thought to myself, and I'm glad I was meeting you today because I only researched this a lot more recently. And I thought to myself, well, if I can see it in my hands, and I actually have torn tendons in both my bicep and my tricep over the past couple of years, just randomly. I'm not taking steroids. I'm not particularly muscular. I'm not doing crazy shit. But, I know how it happened. I know the impact of it, but it was a bit unusual that it actually snapped off. At the tendon, it wasn't the muscle coming off the tendon. It was a tendon snapping, the weakness. And I was wondering whether or not, if someone, say, has some of these indicators, can you check the amyloid level in someone's brain to see whether or not they're accumulating too much amyloid in their brain, which could lead to Alzheimer's?
So we can look at the amyloid in the brain using what's called a PET scan, and we can put in an amyloid marker. So we put a nuclear scan, take a picture of the brain, and it shows you the load or the volume of amyloid in the brain.
So that's an injection with some sort of
radionucleotide.
Yeah, okay, so a colour.
So it's come from Lucas Heights, comes in every day, for instance, to Prince Alfred, Prince of Wales Hospital, and they inject that.
Is it dangerous?
Not dangerous.
No. So you and that thing will sit on the amyloid, and you'll see it through the MRI.
Yep. And you can do a volume then as well. You can say like this, severe, let's say, 40% amyloid volume load in the brain.
Right.
And that's also then can be used to treat against. So now we have what are called monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid. So monoclonal antibodies are activating the immune system. And the best example currently is melanoma. So you can have a monoclonal antibody against melanoma, so it dissolves the melanoma. And for people who had stage 3 or stage 4 melanoma, which is usually a death sentence, are now going into remission because the immune system is clearing the melanoma.
Itself.
Yes. So what we're doing now is adapting that approach for Alzheimer's disease. And 2 medications are currently under review through the TGA here in Australia. They're approved in America through the FDA. And this is an intravenous therapy that's given, say, every month. And it comes in and it basically starts dissolving the amyloid in the brain. Now, at the moment, we can show that on a PET scan. So we see the amyloid getting less and going away. At the moment, that doesn't necessarily transmit into memory coming back, but what it does is it slows the progression. But this is the first generation of therapy, a targeted therapy to a mechanism. And like with melanoma and multiple sclerosis and, inflammatory bowel disease, we're going to get better and better treatments. But this is the first treatment.
So that's very interesting. So if, let's say someone's at this is probably not going to happen to someone in their 30s or 40s, but, as you get older, I guess what this informs people is that, particularly people like me who, generally speaking, have thought, up until more recently, that I'm bulletproof. Like I never really got sick. I had injuries, but I never really got sick. Mostly they were self-inflicted injuries, so to speak. But as we get older, we've got to start thinking about, oh, hang on a minute, we've got another 20 years to go, or hopefully more. What are the things that I need to get checked out instead of just ignoring stuff? So if we're looking at just generally apart from, I want to talk about maintenance after that, like the sorts of things, how we should be living our lives, perhaps. And I don't mean in a like a demanding way, but we'll just talk about the perhaps ways you can live your life. But what are the things that, from neurodegenerative point of view, like cognition and things like that, what should we be sort of becoming aware of without getting paranoid about it?
Well, I think you're the perfect model of what should happen. So I think if you have an interest and you want to look after yourself, what are the things that are reversible that I could take control of? And that would start with a review with your general practitioner, and that would be screening vascular approaches. If there was some worry about a family history, you could go and be referred to a neurologist, and that would incorporate a clinical examination. Also then looking at neuropsychometry. So in other words, testing your memory. So this would go on for about an hour, and I know that you had that in the United States. And again, that would inform. So let's say you score right across the board completely normally. Well, that's the baseline. That's important to know. If there was some unusual changes there, that might then inform to go on to the next step, which could be, for instance, a brain scan, like an MRI, or there might be, if you had a family history of particular things, you might go and have a PET scan, and you might have an amyloid PET scan looking for these conditions. At the moment, we don't know when to treat. So in neurology, we're treating patients when they're manifesting the conditions. So when they have some memory issues and they have, minor changes, but actually functioning pretty normally, and they have evidence of amyloid either on the PET scan or a lumbar puncture. So taking some fluid out from the spine and testing it for amyloid. But one of the next questions is, what happens if you came from a family and you knew there was Alzheimer's in the family? When should we start treatment? And that's research. So what we need to do is try and work out, when do we start treatment? What we really need is a biomarker of a change. And one of those, and this is where the field is at the moment, can we take blood tests on individuals to try and work out where they are? And we know one of those markers is called neurofilament, which is a blood test, and that's a marker of a brain cell being distressed, so neurofilament goes up. So if I had a family history of dementia and I knew that I was at risk of Alzheimer's disease, and if I had a blood test and my neurofilament's going up, I can be pretty sure I'm going to be starting to manifest the condition, so I should start treatment. And that's where the field is.
You can ask your doctor for that?
You can ask your doctor for that.
Or at least discuss it with your doctor, and your doctor will advise. Because it's interesting you should say that, because, and I don't know what the reason for this is, but I remember 25 years ago, I had a friend who, one of the original people who set up the colonoscopy department at St. Vincent's, like 30 years ago. He's passed away now, but he's a gastroenterologist. When I spoke to him, his name was Dr. Steve Mistillis, and I said, Steve, in my consultation, the first thing he asked me is about my family. And he built up a probability chart, a statistical probability chart. And off the back of that, he said, let's say I was 40 at the time. He said, you need to have a colonoscopy. And then we need to do one every couple of years. And we can measure, manage, mark it up, et cetera. And fortunately for me, I didn't have any issues. But he did build a probability algorithm. Why has that not been the case for neurology? Why haven't we had that same sort of discipline when it comes to neurology? We've had it with hearts as well. Why have we not had that with brains?
Very good question. I think we're a bit slow on the uptake, but that's an important part of the history now. I suppose also we're realizing that brain and mind conditions are linked. So we know in these genes that are connected to neurodegeneration and dementia, families have higher incidence of autism spectrum disease, of schizophrenia, of bipolar, of mania. So we've been probably focusing on the one disease. So someone comes in and you're worried about, Alzheimer's disease. We're asking about Alzheimer's disease. We're not taking a fuller history of the family. And this is now incredibly important. And we've realized this. But you have to do a very intricate family history. And I think that's an interesting voyage for everyone to do regardless.
What does that mean, an intricate family history?
Well, you want to go through all of the conditions that affect each individual. And there's usually a family historian. There's someone who likes doing this. And then what you have to do is you have to get them involved. Because people say, have you got any family history? No, I don't. But then when you start giving them certain conditions, anyone have, bipolar disease? Oh, yeah, Uncle Joe and, my cousin. And it starts filling up. You've got to be, it's like Sherlock Holmes. You've really got to start probing in depth. And clinicians have to do that.
The problem is that we all get interested in stuff, and I see this in the economy. We get interested in stuff, then we get caught back up in our day-to-day stuff the next day, and we pretty much park everything that we've just been told or heard or read or thought about or discussed. And then we get caught up in our day-to-day stuff, and then we don't attend to the most important things. Someone asked me the other day, I was talking to Larry Emder on Channel 7, and he was fascinated about Project 100, right, because he follows me. And he said, mate, that sounds like a full-time job. And I said, Larry, living is a full-time job. And you got to think of it that way. Because we spend more time full-time on things that are not as important as the thing we should be thinking about full-time. That's our life. Yeah. And our families' lives.
Yeah.
I mean, as a clinician, as a scientist, and what do you think about that? I mean, as a concept, do people only come to you when they're really crook?
Yeah, well, and that's why I was keen to do this show with you, because I think this is the important message. But yeah, as a clinician, patients come to see me and there's only two outcomes. They get well and they'll never see me again, or they continue on and they won't see me after that either. Yeah. So and I think we've got to take your message on board and don't sweat the small stuff, but focus on ourselves. You've got to be able to look after yourself. That's a critical part. You can't achieve anything unless you start to do that.
So can I just talk about alcohol, drugs, alcohol? Well, let's call it lifestyle. Where does it sounds pretty basic, but it's pretty fundamental and fundamentally important. Where does sleep, and I don't know if you guys do anything about sleep at your institution, sleep, nutrition, and exercise. And when I say nutrition, I include what you shouldn't have and what you should have, like alcohol, drugs, what you shouldn't have perhaps, and also, but what you should have too in terms of proper nutrition. Where do those three things fit in what you guys do?
Yeah. Well, they're critically important in terms of management in a general sense. So we know there's a system that is activated when we sleep, only in the deepest sleep, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, where filters come on in the brain and filter out all of the proteins and chemicals in the brain that you've accumulated in that 24 hours. And unless you have that deep sleep, you can't clear these toxins from the brain. So
my mother never slept. You know that?
And that's an important part. We don't know whether it's cause or effect. Was it the underlying process causing the sleep disturbance, or is the sleep problem causing the underlying degeneration?
That's interesting.
But yeah, I think sleep now we recognize is a critical part of this jigsaw that's coming together.
So let's just quickly talk about sleep. So how would I know, or how would someone know if they're not getting a proper sleep? I mean, are there like you should not wake up at once, or you should wake up feeling fresh? I mean, what is it?
Well, symptoms: wake up feeling fresh. You can get headaches, high blood pressure. They're often features of not getting enough sleep, and particularly sleep apnea. And then the quickest way to resolve that is to have a sleep study. And most sleep studies now can be organised through your GP, done at home, and then reported by a
they're done at home?
More often than not now. People don't want to go into sleep laboratories, but also you don't sleep as well in an artificial bed, in an artificial room, in a place you haven't been to before, as you do in your own bed. So sleep studies can be done at home and then reported by the sleep physician or neurologist who's in charge.
And is that something that Neuro does?
Yeah. So we've got sleep laboratories, but most hospitals around Australia will have a sleep expert or sleep physician.
And then what about let's talk about nutrition before we talk about exercise, like what you shouldn't and what you should take.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not here to be a moralist, but the more I read about alcohol, basically no alcohol. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it doesn't mean you don't have to have any alcohol. It doesn't necessarily follow if you have a drink, but I guess it's about excess. But what do you think about alcohol and drugs?
Well, you're right. If you want to be really healthy, there's no alcohol, and you have to work out a lifestyle. That's a lifestyle decision. The current idea is that 2 to 3 standard drinks 3 to 4 times a week for a male and 1 to 2 for a female is, inverted commas, healthy drinking. But in a way, the recommendation is no drinking. So
no
doctors
booze.
would say no drinking.
Yeah.
And we're looking at levels that are called healthy, but there's no such thing as healthy levels.
Yeah.
So you have to just take that on board.
So you are taking a risk when you drink no matter what.
Absolutely.
Because alcohol itself is okay, but it's the acetaldehyde that gets produced, which is the poison.
Yes.
And your brain doesn't like it.
And it's toxic to the brain.
It's toxic, yeah.
And a bit like we're talking about the, punches to the head, it's a cumulative effect.
Yeah.
And it's not healthy.
Yeah. And drugs, like let's call it recreational drugs, because just about every kid in Australia these days takes cocaine if they're under 30. They don't even drink, they just take cocaine. It's out of control. Cocaine, marijuana.
Very unhealthy.
Unhealthy.
Yeah.
Again.
Dangerous. And unfortunately, it can be just like a first episode of cocaine can lead to a spasm of a blood vessel. It can lead to brain hemorrhages. Plus, we don't even know, what's in the cocaine. Where's it come from? What's being mixed in with it? So very unhealthy.
What about food generally? Someone asked me this morning about nootropics. What do you think about those sorts of things, nootropics? I mean, it's a big, broad spectrum thing. I mean,
yeah.
People say, for example, right now, 5 milligrams of creatine a day is quite healthy for us. It's a big thing now. Everyone's talking about it.
Yep.
What do you think about, I don't know if that is a nootropic. It's not a plant-based thing, but what do you think about nootropics generally?
Well, look, I think we're getting a much better understanding of diet now and the importance of diet and brain health. And protein is incredibly important. And as you're right, like creatine now, it turns out, is beneficial for brain function. We also know that protein is very important.
But not a lot of creatine, but just a little bit of creatine.
That's it.
Yep.
And same with protein. Not too much, and it needs to be spread across protein sources. But we know, for instance, that if you have a protein diet and you do resistance exercise, that promotes brain function and brain health. And there's a whole industry now, an understanding of frailty. And how do you prevent frailty? Well, frailty is part of the whole neurodegenerative process, and you can manage it by regular exercise, resistance training, protein intake. So that's a critical message for all of us.
It's funny, many years ago, there was a well-known professor at St. Vincent's named Professor Ron Penny, professor of immunology.
Yep.
His son Mark is a kidney specialist. And Ron was a client of mine, and when I was in the law firm, and also a good friend of mine. And Ron, of course, died of dementia. Like crazy, like the fittest guy, no weight on him. Used to walk up and down to level 6, 7, where it was, every day up in the stairs of Vincent's. Like, didn't drink, and like a super smart guy, super bright guy. He would have been like 80, I'd say, when he passed away. Anyway, I said to Mark, "Are you going to get a genetic test for this?" And Mark is also a professor at St. Vincent. He said, the answer to me, he said, no. He said, because even if I find out, I'm going to get anxious if I find out I have got it. So there's no point in that. He said, and by the way, if I did have the gene for it, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to get it. And he went on to say then, if I did have it, if I did get dementia, he said, the first thing they're going to tell me is exercise, high intensity exercise. What is high intensity? Is it about blood flow? What are we talking about? Why is high intensity exercise important?
Well, we know it's important again from epidemiology. Why is it important? Well, definitely part of it is the blood flow. But are there other processes that are as yet unknown? Yeah, it must be similar to your discussion about neurotransmitters, etc. Like there are things going on in the brain that we don't understand, but it's established. It's a fact.
Yeah, well, it's because I guess that then brings me over to my final question to you in terms of lifestyle is about obesity. And because one of the things you asked me to do is, because my grandfather was a diabetic, type 2. So in other words, acquired diabetes from lack of whatever. He's on my dad's side. And when I reveal that to you, and this is when we're doing the family stuff, you said you better go get a glucose test, which is not a very pleasant test, but I put it up on my Instagram actually. But it's like they sort of take your blood before you do the test your sugar levels and your insulin levels. Then they hit you with this massive amount of glucose, and over a 3-hour period, they test your glucose and insulin levels to see whether you're insulin resistant, or your insulin's or you just don't have enough, and you can't clear the glucose to get it back to the homeostasis, like a normal level. And of course, diabetes too has relationship to weight. What is the deal with being, in terms of lifestyle, what's the deal with being overweight, and not necessarily obese, but just overweight, unhealthy overweight, and diabetes relative to neurological disease?
Well, I think you've covered the whole territory very well yourself, and I think you're
only because you told me about it.
You're very thoughtful, but you're exactly right. So the first thing is we look at a fasting blood sugar level. So is the blood sugar level high? And in other words, is someone diabetic or not? And we know that diabetes is a controllable, manageable risk factor for dementia and memory problems.
Is that right?
Yes. So you would intervene. If I was a diabetic, very aggressive therapy, sugars is, in the low normal range, best outcomes for long-term memory function. Now we're starting to understand that it's not a binary decision, either you're diabetic or not. There's a whole middle territory, which what you've said, insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is promoted, for instance, by being overweight or obesity. So they're linked. And can we try and manage this insulin resistance by losing weight? And that's why now governments are taking this on by, for instance, doing, interventions for weight loss, surgery for weight loss. And that's because we know that if weight is managed, it helps all the other sort of complications, particularly insulin resistance, which is also linked to cognitive dysfunction, memory problems, dementia, also peripheral neuropathy. But I'm focusing on neurology, but all of the systems in the body are connected.
So, I think what you're sort of saying, what's coming from this then, is that all of those things we discussed in terms of lifestyle, food, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and or where you don't do those things, you're obese, you got you're type 2 diabetic, or you have diabetes generally. All of these things relate to the heart as well. All of these relate probably to every organ in your body. Like if you're not in good shape, your liver could have a problem, or your kidneys could have a problem. You're saying, well, yeah, the brain can have a problem too, as a neurologist, and pretty much it comes back to this very same point. Live healthy. Get the 3 strategies right: sleep, diet, and exercise. That's a big start. That's a huge start.
Massive.
Are there any exercises that you would recommend that we should do just to sort of maybe get our brain fit?
Yeah, the brain loves being challenged. So anything new helps the brain. And whether that's, for instance, learning a new language, having a new hobby, doing dancing, getting a new, interest in life, that grows the brain. How can you challenge the brain? Do things differently each day. So, for instance, don't just do the same drive home every day. Oftentimes you get home and you think, I can't even remember the trip home. It's like you're unconscious and you think, have I got a memory problem? No, your brain switches off. So what you want to do is keep on challenging the brain and driving new function. So we also know that cells that fire together wire together, and that's the basis of plasticity. So we know that if you can try and increase different approaches, you'll strengthen the connections across brain networks, which is important for brain health. The brain does get bored.
Oh, really? So that's one of the reasons, maybe I can't remember who told me this, but I change hands with toothbrushes. Like some mornings I'll do left, some mornings I'll do right, some mornings I'll start on the right or another mornings I'll start on the left. So you're saying that
Perfect.
Stuff is actually like a brain exercise.
It's an important brain exercise. And I think deep down you're a brain enthusiast. So I think you love this challenge. And I think we all have to do these things. The challenge is incredibly important for brain health.
Could that be a reason why people, when they do something they don't want to do, for example, let's say it's middle of winter and I'm all nice and cozy and warm and I jump in one of those ice baths and I feel great after it, but
Exactly.
I don't want to get in it. But
Exactly.
after it, I think I'm glad I did that.
Yeah. And the brain releases its sort of pleasure hormones because of that. So you feel good afterwards because you've done something. The brain likes it. It's a release.
But I didn't want to do it in the first place. So, once I did it, I feel good.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. So, sort of, you got to keep. It's a bit like going to the gym. If you go to the gym and do the same exercise, same weight every day for the rest of your life, you won't. Nothing changes.
Yeah.
So you got to keep tricking your body. So you got to keep tricking your brain too.
Yeah, and I think learning new tasks, learning new languages. I mean, the brain is always ready to be activated.
Is there any point in time in your age when you should stop that, or just keep doing it?
You got to keep doing it.
So, and is maybe that's one of the reasons why retirement's not a great idea, because it sort of puts you in a position where you're pretty much no longer challenging anything, and you're, as we go to, it's funny you should say, because I was only thinking about the other day, as you get older, you've accumulated more, you've got less stress in your life, you tend to get into this rhythm of doing exactly the same thing every day, and you're comfortable. And I often wondered to myself, is that a reason why we age? Because we're no longer challenged.
It is. And that's also recently been brought out by the Lancet Commission. Social engagement and new experiences are part of the modifiable approaches to preventing neurodegeneration and managing it. So it's incredibly important to be part of your community, to be doing different things, to stay involved. And as you say, detaching yourself and retiring, pulling yourself out and doing your own thing is not good for the brain.
Well, mate, I am not going to retire. Whatever happens.
We're all happy.
I have one more question for you, and it's like, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but what do you think about people using mobile phones?
Well, look, to be honest.
Relative to the brain I'm talking about.
Yeah. The jury's out. And at the moment, all of the epidemiology hasn't shown an increase in a particular type of issues.
Epidemiology means the study of the universe of people who use phones relative to those people who get neurological disease.
Yeah. So I think we've got to keep an open mind. And then ultimately it will come down to lifestyle. But I couldn't give I don't have any insight into anything more than is available in the public.
But what does Dr. Matthew Kiernan do? Does he put things in his ear, or what do you call it, his earbuds, or does he get on the mobile phone, or does he just put it on speaker? What do you do?
I get on the mobile phone.
You actually put it up to your ear?
Yeah. What do you do?
I got the earbuds, but someone told me the other day the earbuds are bad for me. So I don't know. But mostly though, I put it on loudspeaker.
Okay, I'm going to do that from now on. I'm going to tell everyone that you told me to do that.
It's funny because I spoke to the treasurer recently, and I said to him, "Mate, you got to change the GST instead of putting interest rates up. Just put the GST up, and then when the economy recovers, the inflation gets better, put the GST down." And he said, "I'm going to tell everybody Mark Boris sent me," but he was being quite cynical. You were being funny, but he was being cynical towards me, and I appreciate that. We covered dementia, Alzheimer's, dementia, and some of the other parts of dementia. We've covered Parkinson's. We did talk briefly about MND. To me, one of the great, and I have so much respect and actually totally jealous of people like you. Or envious.
Vice versa.
Envious. No, but I am envious. I'll be honest, I am so envious because I think, apart from outer space, the brain is the great inner space. Like we want to send rockets to Mars and stuff like that. But there's an inner space that is just totally undiscovered. And that's what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
So what are the initiatives at Neuro? What are you guys doing there? Like, tell me some of the stuff. Is there any cool stuff happening? I'm sure there is.
Well, for a start, as you say, it's the most interesting thing I think in the world. I mean, I'm biased.
No, totally. But you are biased, but I'm not. And I actually think if I, at my age and what I've sort of done a lot of things, and I think, well, what's really interesting to me? What's really cool? Elon Musk says the same thing. Neuralink.
Yeah.
Elon Musk is trying to work out how to insert things to make you use limbs that you couldn't ordinarily use by somehow stimulating the brain or whatever he does with the Neuralink. And I know other people in Australia, we're doing these sorts of things here in Australia too. We had Nicholas Opie on this show, not this Project 100, but we had Nick Opie on the Mentor show. And I think his business is called Synchron, which is one of the big businesses equivalent to Elon Musk's show. And Nicholas is a biomedical engineer, but they're also doing, they're in the US, but they're putting implants into people's brains to try and help them live better lives. But the brain really is the inner space.
Yeah.
Do you realize how cool that is? Or are you just so busy doing your stuff?
No, absolutely. And I think you're right. You've got to take a step back and think about it. But everything we've done here today is all brain related. You're talking, you're listening, you're thinking. I mean, how are you thinking? What's going on there? And, later on tonight, you'll have dinner and then you'll go to bed and you'll fall asleep. And
Hopefully.
The system will be unconsciously, your heart's going to be beating at 50 to 60 beats per minute. You're going to be breathing 14 to 15 breaths a minute all the way through while you're unconscious. Your brain's doing all of this. And it's going to clear all of the toxins from the day, and then it's going to wake up the next morning. You're going to feel refreshed, and bang, but we just take all of this for granted. But it's the unconscious brain that is just working all the time. I mean, it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing to think about. And then we're starting to now try and work out thoughts, people thinking. And this
As in consciousness?
Consciousness. We haven't worked out what consciousness is. Do you think this is chemical? Isn't it weird that you can go for an operation and the anaesthetist can put you to sleep and you've got no memory?
Yeah.
And you wake up and it's all gone. It's all happened. That's just amazing. But we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know how to control it other than through deep sedation and anesthetic agents. But that's something that people are very interested in. Similarly, thinking. And that has lots of implications. And for instance, our defense forces, everyone is interested in thinking. And also, can we, inverted commas, this is now sounding science fiction, can we read people's minds? Can we tell whether people are lying? This is where the future is going. And we're starting to see that through our very rudimentary techniques, through MRI, functional imaging, and we're getting very simple parts of this jigsaw. But you can imagine that probably in 5 to 10 years' time, yes, we will be able to see thoughts. Can we see an individual thought? Can we see a release of dopamine for pleasure? It's amazing where this is going to go. We're right at the beginning.
I saw a very interesting piece on The Conversation, the ABC's show, and where they were talking about some experiments and or discoveries, but not in a sense that those discoveries are going to change anything in the future, but there's things they're working on whereby they put individuals in MRI machines for quite a long period of time, and they played porn to them, and they saw which parts of their brain lit up, and then they were able to then put them back in a machine and suggest certain things to them, and they were able to read effectively. The machine was able to read their mind by reading what actually lit up in their brain. And one of the obviously we can extend anything we want, but one of the extensions of that is, in time, will we have MRI machines at an airport, but ones that's not one you have to lay in for 30 minutes, or whatever. But when you just, as you walk through, the software's so fast and the equipment's so good that it actually can read your mind of whether or not perhaps you're going to be you're intending to commit terrorism.
That's exactly where the field is.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and when you talk about consciousness, when we talk about living, and I don't talk about this, but some people do talk about living forever or never dying. And, Brian Johnson's one of those people. But in order to achieve that, maybe what's going to happen is they're going to get your consciousness and they're going to transport it into a machine. So your body, biologically, you'll fall apart. Your body will die. But your consciousness, Matthew Kiernan's consciousness, will exist in something in here. And somehow they're going to transfer your consciousness, which means you will live forever. Or another way of saying it is your consciousness will live forever. And by the way, Schrodinger, whilst he did the cat experiment, or the cat thought experiment, Schrodinger sort of wrote a book on consciousness, and he called it the universal consciousness. And as a physics professor, he talked about there is a universal consciousness, and that, I'm getting a bit weird now, but when you die, all our consciousness go to one place, and they actually never leave us, because energy, the conservation of energy principle, energy never dies; it just changes form.
Yeah, exactly.
And the question is, where does it go?
Got us going there. But brain-computer interfaces are occurring now. And one of the ideas is that, yes, you would download your whole memory function. And that'll be a question for society. But the other issue is, do you want to go through an experiential life? Like, do you want to have these experiences and learn from those experiences? Or do you just want to inherit Mark Burris's brain, plug it in, and that's version 2.0 and go from that? At the moment, I think we probably
Can I get royalties for that?
You can.
Yeah, or my family or someone.
Lots of people will buy it. I'd buy it. and it's going to turn over very rapidly.
Yeah.
The other thing is, people mathematically model all of this. So Alan Turing, that's how he got into, and that developed the whole idea of a computer and artificial intelligence. Yeah. People are trying to mathematically model consciousness, and that's possible, but it still doesn't let us know where consciousness is. But this is where, there are so many things going on that are just very, very inspiring and amazing.
As CEO of Neuro, though, do you maybe just get into the sort of the weeds here a little bit, not as Dr. Matthew Kiernan or Professor Matthew Kiernan, but as CEO of Neuro, do you, the business that is, do you sit down and say to your team, have a strategy session and say, okay, these are the areas we're going to go for, apart from the clinical stuff that you do in terms of helping people get better, et cetera, or diagnosing stuff? Do you actually go into these really crazy places? Yeah,
we do.
Yeah, that's
and
cool.
In fact, what we need to do more, we have to do more of that, and we have to engage more with industry. We know that, and we have to get out more. So that's the message. Get out more, interact with people like yourself in financial markets, all industry, and that includes then imaging, repositories, financial. There's neurosciences everywhere. There's neuroscience down in the local Woolworths. Why do you think that certain, sales are at certain levels, eyesight? This is all neuroscience. It's applied neuroscience. It's all informed. So people have done that research, and we want to see more and more of that, as well as society wants us to tackle the real problems of our day. And the real problem of our day at the moment is dementia. So society is putting a big focus. The governments are saying we need to manage this and we need to understand it. So that's the big ticket item at the moment.
Where are you guys at with dementia at Neuro? What's going on now?
Well, for a start, we've been very lucky that the community has been engaged with Neuro over 30 years, and patients who've come there have donated very kindly their brains and their histories and biomarkers. We're now trying to understand mechanistic inputs for neurodegeneration and dementia, discover new therapies. We're incorporating now, at the moment, to look at a brain, a person might do a PhD and count every single cell in one part of the brain for Parkinson's disease. We know that's not efficient. We need to get AI. So we're trying to bring all of the strengths of the university's AI systems to help us tackle neurological problems.
So you're working with engineers?
Engineers. So the Faculty of Engineering at University of New South Wales has 1,000 PhD students. They want impact and translation. They want to be involved in the brain. They want to be involved with neuro. So this is a great synergy, great bridge.
And you said earlier on the brain bank. So NeuRA has its own brain bank, or there's a brain bank attached to NeuRA?
NeuRA has its own brain bank, and we are supplying tissue nationally and internationally. So actually, just yesterday, Emory University wanted a large number of samples with a particular neurodegenerative condition. So provided it's got ethics approval and it's all scientifically valid, we supply those tissues and samples from Australian patients to drive international research and outcomes. We're trying to improve outcomes globally.
I don't want to come work for you. Please.
Well, I'll run your enterprise and you can have mine.
This is a swap.
For a day.
Professor Matthew Kiernan, thanks very much for everything,
thanks,
mate.
Mark. And
awesome.
thanks for your support.
You're welcome, mate.